Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our 42nd housing market update. Now, you might remember back in those terrible days of COVID, it was the COVID webinar. We are now the housing market update number 42 and our last of the year. So we are so thrilled to have you all here. And as we move forward, make sure that you all know that we are in a position to help you in a lot of different markets. I'm going to introduce Allie in just a second, but Allie oversees our economics department, which is part of advisory. We're nationwide, and we're here to help, whether it's with segmentation, whether it's with new development, rental property. We're here, and just all you've got to do is reach out to us, and we will be there, just like Michael Jackson. All right. Now, Mark, I just want to make sure you guys can get online, grab one of these. If you're looking at a new market or you want to confirm what's going on in your backyard, just go to zondahome.com and Market Snapshots. You can download one for free, check it out. And we're trying to always upgrade and update those. So please check it out. And as you know, we track a huge amount of information, and purposefully, we are dividing, slicing, and dicing that into different formats for different parts of our industry. So we've got the Building Product Pro for the BPM side of the world, Enterprise for those heavy users in the residential side of the world, and Mortgage Pro. So please, if you need to find out about those, reach out to your local director of business development or one of us. We would be happy to help you. Also, we're really excited to announce the latest release of our Zonda iPad 10.5. And it's our most popular app. Of course, this thing is easy peasy to work with. It's getting more and more visually appealing. We've just added latitude and longitude search inputs. There's all sorts of sorting and exporting features, and you can use it on a Mac. So we're listening to the requests of our friends, and we're upgrading and updating as we go. And one of the things that we've expanded into is the rental housing side of the world, because we have a multifamily practice that's led by Kimberly Byram. We do a huge amount of rental single family work, which Molly and I and many of us are involved with. And now we're putting that into an ongoing rental housing outlook, or we call it the RHO. It's a quarterly look. It has data, but also it's got insights and input. I welcome you to check it out. It's pretty good stuff, and we're going to keep it going forward. Also, we're very pleased to announce we've got this suite of really cool things that will help you. We call it the Sales and Marketing Suite, combined with Livable, U-Tour, and Virtual. And of course, Livable is a free online service. You can list your homes. We'll help you get them sold and sold fast. Zonda Virtual, you can use 3D design and renderings to show product in your communities. And then U-Tour just allows shoppers to access models at any time on their time. And our whole goal here is trying to make the sales and marketing process more and more frictionless. One other thing we want to add is we've got a new program we're going to be bringing to you in December in Miami Beach. Elevate, and we call it the Art of High-Rise Living. And the concept here is that, so much of what we do is horizontal, but we're also in the world of housing, building vertically. And that ties very well into our future place work, where we're examining how to build better and the newest and most wonderful new products. And now we're bringing it vertical. So please join us there December 4th to 6th. It's in Miami Beach. So here is our plan for today. And Allie's going to step in just a minute, but we'll talk about the consumer housing. I'll talk and step in for supply and lots. And then we'll talk a little bit about the big A, affordability. Now, by way of introduction, and I think I've introduced Allie, a few hundred times, but there's always the key things I want to remind you of. She's our chief economist. She's always digging for the so what. She's a traveler. She goes on worldwide trips and brings back great ideas that she brings into our business. She's also a joy to work with. But one of the things I want to make sure you know is that she's very, very creative, and you'll see it today, but she's also creative on another side. And one of Allie's favorite times of year is Halloween. Now, last year, she and her husband, John, dressed up as two members from KISS. And Allie's pretty dang good with makeup because they were spot on. This year, she scared the hell out of me. This year, her husband, John, was little Georgie, the little boy wearing the yellow raincoat from the movie It. She was Pennywise. And she was spot on. And I could only look at the picture once, and then I had to get rid of it. Allie, even though you scared the hell out of me then, I'm so glad you're here today. Allie, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. I don't know if anyone else on this call loves Halloween, but I plan my Halloween costume. Next year's already planned as of the day after this year's Halloween. Obsessed. Love it. But anyways, let's get down to business. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on our 42nd housing market update. And where I wanted to start today was with a data point that we discussed on our last webinar. So let's just recap this very quick, and then I'll tell you why we're talking about this again. So we had said that GDP is the broadest measure of the economy, and it comes out from the BEA on a quarterly release. And the challenge is when you're trying to talk about the broadest measure of the economy, you really don't want a lagged and quarterly report. You want to get some real-time feedback about what's happening. That's why the Atlanta Federal Reserve had come up with GDP Now. And when we had met on our last webinar, we said, wow, this GDP Now is saying that there's a lot of really strong growth going on, and we got to see how the actual data comes out. Well, this was spot on. When we got the report, what we ultimately found is that GDP did have this blockbuster report in the third quarter. This really stands in the face of the Federal Reserve doing these 11 short-term rate increases. And when you see this kind of outperformance, to me, it really begs the question, what drove that strength? And that's going to be our main focus of this first component. Now, for some of you that took Econ 101, let's just go back to what GDP is. Now, this is alphabet soup, but GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, don't shut off if you don't know what that means, because it is very simple. We're basically saying the economy is comprised of consumer spending plus business spending plus government spending plus net exports. Now, that's important because you then want to say, all right, if we had such a strong economic backdrop last quarter, what drove that strength? Well, here you can check out the trends. You can look at the dollar amount, third quarter last year, third quarter this year, and that percent change. Now, your eye maybe went to the government services, 4.5%, so lots of growth there. But in terms of the overall dollar amount, pretty small when you're looking at the bigger picture. What some of you have probably heard, or I'd say most of you have heard, is that consumers represent 70% of the economy. That comes from this calculation, where consumers really have this outsized impact on overall economic growth and really strong spending numbers last quarter. What we saw is 2.4% growth, with consumers increasing their spending year over year, both in services and in goods. So if we understand that to be the case, to me, I'm saying, wow, we've been growing a lot over the past few years and we're continuing to grow. What has fueled that spending? Now, it's quite simple. It goes down to savings and debt. And we're going to talk about these two things because there are definitely some shifts that I would say are early in the data, but I think are absolutely worth watching. So let's go back to the savings discussion. We know, especially if you have been joining us throughout all 42 of these housing market updates, that we had this extremely elevated level of savings throughout the pandemic because of the student loan forbearance, the stimulus, the change in overall life stage and lifestyle. And as we look at this, we got to a point that people had excess savings, and that excess savings was being spent in the economy, and that is part of what fueled our inflation numbers. Now, as you track out that excess savings, there's a debate of how much of that is left. But Bloomberg did a story on Federal Reserve data that shows that for most households, that excess savings has now been depleted, with the exception of being the highest income households where they're still above where they would have been. Now, as we look at this, we're saying, okay, so consumers have been spending. They've been burning through that savings to fuel that spending. Are they then adding back to their savings accounts? Well, the answer is not really. Again, if you go back to pre-pandemic, somewhere between 5 and 10% was our normal savings rate. How much of our income were we setting aside? Where we are today, 3.4%. So we're tracking this, and this is a big difference compared to where we were over the past few years. But what we know is people are working through those savings and people are putting more money on credit cards, for example. Now, this chart, we would have shown probably 6 to 9 months ago. We had been looking at what we were seeing with consumer balance sheets. And when we tracked this out, you will see this being reported on. And I think it's a bit of a data sin because you're looking at total credit card balances going back over time, way above 2019, way above the mid 2000s. But this isn't adjusted for inflation. I don't think that's the best way to be looking at what we're seeing with overall credit card balances. So we can do that. We adjust this data and we say, all right, there's no doubt that credit card balances are going up, they're trending up, and they have done so since 2012. But at least when you look at it compared to last cycle, we're not way above, we're actually a little bit below. But I think as you look at this, the general trend is, yes, we're relying a little bit more on credit cards. And I don't want to stand here and say, okay, credit is bad, because credit isn't bad if you can pay it back. In fact, there's a lot of advantages to putting your purchases on those credit cards, whether it's building credit, whether it's the rewards that you get, or maybe allowing you to keep more money in savings, earning that interest, and then paying off your bill every month. Now, that's the key thing. Paying off your bill every month and on time. That's when we believe credit is good. And as we think back to pre-pandemic times, during the pandemic, where we've been over the past couple of years, we have seen that people have generally been paying back their loans. Now, student loans, notice that came down during the student loan forbearance, so that number just has some artificial influence in it. But generally speaking, reasonable levels of delinquent balances, not really seeing anything concerning. Now, this data came out this week for the third quarter. And I would say some of the trends are a little bit alarming, a little bit concerning that I think are worth mentioning. So here, now you're looking at the new delinquent balances. These are at 30 days, and we're looking at by credit type. So home equity revolving, not concerned about. Mortgage, not concerned about. Student loans, not concerned about. But if you track out the history of the auto loans and credit loans, I'd say auto loans, we are at the highest level since 2017, but it looks a bit of a reversion back to where we were pre-pandemic, maybe a little bit elevated, but not as concerning. Credit card debt, as you track that over and you look at those delinquent balances, right now we're at the highest level we've seen since 2011. So this has been a pretty sharp and a pretty dramatic increase. But again, this is looking at 30 days. Maybe someone just, I guess many people fell behind, and we want them to catch back up. We really don't want people to turn into seriously delinquent, which is 90 plus days. So auto loans, you track that out again. Right now, the seriously delinquent is at the highest level it's been since 2010. Credit card seriously delinquent puts us back to the highest level since 2012. Now, if you look at these data sets, we did see a little bit of an increase in the second quarter, a more pronounced increase in the third quarter. We're going to watch this very closely because to us, we feel like this is showing us some early potential cracks in the system, some potential cracks with the consumer. And I'd say very importantly, as we look at this data, know that it is through the third quarter. Third quarter means we are not including October, which is when we saw the resumption of the student loan payments. So think back, we've talked about this in the past, about how the student loans, people did not have to take a penalty. They did not have to accrue interest. It was part of the pandemic forgiveness that we saw, just giving people a little bit more leeway, a little bit more time. But now what we're seeing is that those payments came back due last month. Now, it's hard to find an exact average on student loans because it depends on what level of education, public versus private access, lots of factors that go into this. But generally speaking, we're looking at $200 to $300 per month. Now, Morning Consult talked to consumers and said, okay, hey, these payments are due. What are you going to do differently now that student loans have to be paid every month again? Well, 74% of people say they plan to reduce spending on non-essential items to afford their student loans. 69% plan to reduce travel or cut back on unnecessary trips. 67% plan to find additional work or increase those hours to earn more. So we have this resumption of a payment that someone was making before the pandemic, or there may have been some people that have graduated since the pandemic and this is their first time making those payments. At the same time that we do know there's higher inflation across the board, there's still higher shelter costs, and we are starting to see a little bit of that crack, like we talked about, from consumers. Now, if you think about the resumption of student loans and you think about it related to our industry, We've talked about in the past how if people maintained their jobs and they saved that money, it was actually really good for the housing industry because for many younger folks, it allowed them to finally save some money towards a down payment. But let's think about it reversing course now. So as we look at this, we know that if someone had student loans over the past few years, they still had to qualify for those mortgages, assuming that they had those student loans. So even though they weren't making the payment, that did go into their debt to income ratio. So there's not going to be a qualification change based on this. But I do wonder if there's a wallet share shift, a mental mindset of where do I want to put my money? Am I comfortable spending my money elsewhere in the economy, or do I want to put it more towards housing? Now, I'm not saying this is a guarantee whatsoever. This is a hypothetical, I'd say worst case situation. But if you have two people that have that average student loan amount and they say, you know what, I don't want to pull back from other things, or I just am not going to change my spending habits because of these new payments. That could result in a hypothetical 6 to 10% hit to home prices. So I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, that consumers say, maybe I'm not going to put as much towards housing, but I can pull back in some other parts of my life. Now, as we look at all of that, there are some data points that we're nervous about, that we're going to be tracking pretty closely. But I want to go back to that GDP now. So we said, wow, huge report third quarter. What is GDP now telling us about where we are right now? Well, here you can track this out. You see that high level of growth, and then you see the adjusted figure through October 23rd. Now, as we look at this, it's actually not October 23rd, October. As we look at this, I think my key takeaway is it feels like that third quarter was more of an aberration, that we're kind of going back to, yes, we're still growing, but we're not growing as blockbuster as what we had just seen. But you have to step back. You say, okay, given all of this information, student loans coming back due, some consumers that are defaulting on their loans, still some broader spending in the overall economy. What's next for the Federal Reserve? They have a lot of different information that they need to take in. Well, let's think back. We know the past two times that the Federal Reserve has met, they've decided to pause. They've basically said, you know what, we need to give it time. We've talked on this webinar before about that long and variable lag. Give it time to see how those 11 short-term rate increases have filtered into the economy so far. And I think the key question is, all right, well, if the Fed is in this pause point, how do we know if they're being successful? How do we know that their current policy level is, quote unquote, sufficiently restrictive? Well, there's many ways to measure their success, but the two I want to focus on here go back to their dual mandate. What are we seeing in the labor market? What are we seeing in inflation? So if we look at the labor market and you look at our year-to-date trends for overall hiring, we've averaged 240,000 jobs every month this year, which is so much slower than the absolutely outrageously high 430,000 jobs that we added every month on average last year. But if you add that extra layer of comparison, where this leaves us is above that 165,000 that we saw in 2019. So moving in the right direction, but still elevated compared to pre-pandemic. Now take those jobs numbers and apply that unemployment rate. What do we see? Well, right now our national unemployment rate is at 3.9%, and this is up compared to when the Fed started raising rates last March, when we had 3.6%. But I'd say of all the data you're going to see in this presentation today, I think you can probably glean the least from the unemployment rate. Because right now, there are a lot of moving parts in that calculation, including in October, we had the UAW strikes. We had more people in the labor force. We did have some layoffs. There's really just a lot of push and pull that I think makes that not so reliable where we are right now. Let's look at a different indicator then. What are we seeing with job openings? Now, job openings are helpful because in theory, a business is not going to be posting a lot of jobs and trying to expand if they see that demand is pulling back or their profitability is in question. During the height of the market, we had 11 million job openings. During the pre-pandemic times, we had 7 million. Where we are today, 9.5. Let's go to incomes. We know that the Federal Reserve has been afraid of what we've talked about before, which is the wage price spiral. The fact that if wages go up, then maybe that means inflation needs to continue to go up, and then wages continue to go up, and you fall into this vicious cycle. Well, as you look at the employment cost index, At the height of the market, we were basically at 6% wage growth year over year, which was double where we were going into the pandemic. Today, 4.5. So all of these are really telling you the same story, that we are seeing improved data, but we're not back to maybe a slower or maybe a more sustainable path. So the Federal Reserve can take all of this into consideration, but then they have to say, all right, well, what about inflation? Inflation has been such a big concern and such a big part of the backdrop. Average of 2% ideal, 9% last year. Now, depending on the data source, we're really between 3 and 5%. I think as you look at inflation, the one thing that we got to pay closely to is if you look over to the most recent stats, what you're basically seeing is we had this pretty straight line down with inflation, and now we're kind of chopping around. We're not continuing to follow that path down. I think for the Federal Reserve, that's giving them pause. That's making them say, okay, well, which way is this ultimately going to go? And if you say, all right, so what's next for the Fed? I think you have to go back to Fed 101, which is they are going to rely on that data dependence. What are they seeing in the data? Does the labor market continue to cool? Do we have any surprises to the positive? Does inflation continue to cool? Or do we get stuck here? And that's really going to drive whether or not they continue to pause, or if either at the end of this year, which I think is unlikely, or maybe into the early parts of next year, they may feel the need to do one more hike. Now, at this point, though, we've spent 15 minutes talking about this high-level discussion, and you may wonder, well, why do I care? I think this is so important, this what's happening in the economic backdrop to our industry right now, because there's a lot of counterintuitive things going on. We're in an environment today where good news coming out of the economy is actually bad news for our industry, and bad news is actually good news for our industry, with a huge caveat being at least in terms of rates. I'm really just talking about how this is playing into mortgage rates. So let me give an example. Here, what we're going to track out along the bottom is going to be the 10-year Treasury yield. Remember, a near perfect correlation with mortgage rates. So we want to be seeing what is happening with the 10-year. 10 years changing in real time all day, every day. So we saw at the beginning of October, we got this really strong jobs report. And what happened was we saw that interest rates had gone up, the 10-year Treasury had gone up in response to that. But more importantly, that jobs report plus the GDP report had changed investor sentiment. Okay, the Fed's going to have to hold higher for longer. The economy is not slowing. They're not being effective. And we saw the 10-year Treasury get to the point that we had comfortably found interest rates in the 8%. Now, this was our new normal for a couple of weeks until we got another jobs report that all of a sudden said, wait, no, actually the labor market's slowing. And oh, by the way, manufacturing's slowing too. And then investors are saying, well, is it higher for longer? Or are we actually finding that the market's slowing down again? And just based on the data release, we saw interest rates go down 0.5%. We are seeing so much volatility in the mortgage markets where little things are moving the market pretty dramatically, which I think is really indicative of this difficulty knowing exactly what is next. But to me, understanding what's happening in the broader economy is so important because of that interconnectivity between what's happening in the economy, the data releases, the 10-year Treasury yield, and then, of course, our industry. What we're dealing with now, depending on the borrower, depending on the day, is 7 to 8% interest rates. What this translates to is a 90% increase in that typical monthly mortgage payment. So the affordability shock, Tim's going to talk about it more. It's no surprise to anyone, but we're continuing to see the fact that we are having this affordability shock is impacting sales. Most notably existing home sales, the largest share of the market. We're still, as we track out the data, we're down compared to last year. We're down compared to 2019. Yes, because of affordability, partly because of a confidence hit, not only related to the broader economy, but people really questioning, do I want to spend that much money for that product? And we know that inventory has been such a constraint on the market. We like to look at active listings by month, by year, and the line that you see that doesn't make it all the way through December is where we are currently. So in October, in September, you do expect to see a seasonal uptick in overall listings. Nationally, we've seen that. So that's good. That at least feels a little bit more normal, but still way below 2019 levels. And we've spent plenty of time talking about why we know inventory is down. The key thing here is that disincentive to sell. 60% of people have a rate under 4%. But we found this data recently, and I was actually surprised how much it varies by where we live. Now, think back to the East-West divide in home sales activity. I think that the percent below 4% in these different markets is both a function of the differences in the market and a result of the differences across the markets. So as we look at this, if you're a more blue state, it means you have a lower lock-in effect. It's not great. You still have a lot of markets where 50 or 55% of people have locked in a rate under 4. But we know that the Eastern US has done better over time, over the past 18 months. So more people still buying homes, even as we have higher interest rates, which is playing into that number. And then you look at the more green states, they're going to have a more severe lock-in effect. California, Utah, Colorado, you're talking now 70% of people that have a rate below 4. And so what's happening is we know that we have seen this low resale inventory funnel people into the new home market. It's not only the fact that resale inventory is limited, it's also that it's aging and it's expensive. Normally, new homes are more expensive than existing. We've seen that price spread has narrowed. So as we track this out, makes sense that is funneling people into our space. And then they're saying, all right, well, what kind of homes are available? I could get a quick move in. That's basically a direct competition to the resale market, but it's brand new. Or I can get a to-be-built home, pick my lot, pick my finishes. And at least this can help me justify paying today's prices or today's interest rates. Plus, by the way, if I work with the builder, then I can get some incentives that can help make the math make a little bit more sense. Tim will talk about incentives later in this presentation, but all of this ties back to the fact that we have had the tale of two different housing markets, where at least through September. Now notice, we're going to talk about October data in a little bit where we've seen this inflection point, but at least through September, we still had sales that were up year over year, that were up compared to 2019. Now let's look at this a little bit further by tracking out that average sales rate. Remember, average sales rate is sales adjusted for supply. And when I've shown this in the past, I've shown 2019, 2021, and current. I'm changing that out. Right now, we're looking at 2019, so healthy pre-pandemic, 2022. Now, the reason I want to show 2022 is this time last year, we were in a pretty ugly place for the housing market. So let's add that comparison of this weaker point of time and then current. So as we track this out, many markets are outperforming where they were going into the pandemic, but I'd say more importantly and more confusing, many markets are outperforming where they were at this time last year. Now, the reason I say that's confusing is because objectively speaking, affordability is worse today. Affordability is worse today than it was last year. But what I attribute the difference to is there's an affordability factor and there's a shock factor. So let's go back to someone that was looking for a home at the end of 2021, and they struggled to find a home because of that limited inventory, found a home towards the end of 22. What they saw is a 60% payment hit in that short window of time. So if someone started their search and they could only afford $500,000, they got down to $341,000. That home is not the same. That location is not the same. That quality is not the same. So some people, and supply in the 300s in most markets is extremely limited. So some people just got forced out of the market because of affordability. Some people just said, you know what, it's not worth it. So at this point of time, this is what we experienced in 2022. And obviously some markets fared better than others last year, East versus West, as you recall. But as we look at this, demand pulls down. We've seen people leave the market. But what we saw throughout this year is the emergence of more of those move-up buyers, those move-down buyers, those relocation buyers, just still some of that buyer pool that can continue to make the math work. All right, so let's say of that smaller pool, You have people that start looking at the end of last year, and then they're looking for a home today. Interest rates have gone up. Obviously, they've been volatile, but now they're looking at a 20% payment shock. Instead of affording $500,000, they're now at $426,000. So that's not great. They are losing that affordability. That's after already losing affordability over the past few years. But to me, this is really the only discernible difference that I can find between what we saw last year versus what we're experiencing today. I want to emphasize, though, that we know the market is not easy. We know that that change in purchasing power is so absolutely severe today. This is just showing you at different base prices, so $1 million, $750,000, $500,000, $250,000. How has that affordability evolved as interest rates have gone up? You can see the same data in the table below. We know that that is such a core part of today's discussion. And we also know that rates will likely be tricky for a while. We've talked about mortgage rates. The last time we met, we talked about why we've seen some of that upward pressure on mortgage rates, but I wanted to show you some forecasts as well. Now, this came directly from US News and World Report, snipped it off their website. They update quite regularly the mortgage rate forecast for Fannie Mae, Wells Fargo, MBA. Now, it shows their previous forecasts and their current forecasts, and it shows that all of them have shifted up. And even over the past 6 weeks, when I last collected this, it shifted up again. So we at Zonda used to have the highest mortgage rate forecast that I had seen at 6.6. Fannie Mae came in above us at 6.7. NHB, for context, 6.4. Now, we've talked before about how we think there are two things that over time can put downward pressure on rates. That's baked into our forecast. I would assume that's probably baked into these other forecasters' analysis, but I don't know for sure. But to us, remember, we think rates by the end of next year more likely down than up based on a Fed rate cut and based on a bit of a normalization between that spread in a 10-year and 30-year fixed rate mortgage. If that does not happen, these forecasts will be wrong. And what we talked about earlier, one data set, surprising to the positive, surprising to the negative, can have a pretty wild ripple effect on what happens to mortgages. So we think there still is a lot of volatility that we have to plan for in the near term. But let's go back to what I said. So we were looking at September data, and what we noticed qualitatively is that October really feels to be an inflection point in the new home market. So as we track out trends, we have in our Zonda database, we track all the over 70% of the production new home market, but we also like to get qualitative feedback. So we say to builders, hey, how does the market feel? Many of you would have seen this. We track this over time. And in October, we had the highest share of builders saying demand is slower, but notice the two categories: slower but not worrisome, slower and causing concern. We had seen slower but not worrisome be the highest response for a while. And that to me makes sense. You have seasonality. September or October should be slower than March, April, May. But notice now that lift that we've seen in demand is slower and causing concern, which is why what we're calling today's market to be seasonality plus. We are experiencing seasonality, true seasonality, for the first time in 3-4 years. But we don't think it's just seasonality. We think it's a little bit more pronounced with some of the feedback that we're getting. Velocity has all but died out. Entry-level buyers are priced out. Move-up buyers are spooked. The combination of rates, insurance, and inflation are now serious. These are all quotes that we're collecting from builders. So we have our big database on the overall market. We have our division president survey. And also in select markets, we have weekly sales and traffic trends. And these basically back up exactly what we had seen. Similar to September, October data is still in most markets above where we were last year, but you are seeing a little bit more of a pronounced seasonal pullback than you would expect this time of year. Again, seasonality plus. Now, as we look at all of this data, we roll all of this together. I definitely think there are risks. Some of those consumer stats make me nervous. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's the start of a problem. We're going to continue to monitor that. But what I also wanted to do was look at the mortgage originations. And I originally pulled this chart to look at how the originations have varied by credit score. But looking at it in this visual, what really stood out to me is how slow overall mortgage originations are. down nearly 30% from pre-pandemic, down 70% compared to the peak of where we were. So we know that the market still just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel easy. Still that relative performance in new versus existing. But I think the biggest takeaway for me in this data is you think about all of the risks, all of the challenges, think back to now, looking at how mortgage originations look by credit score over time. What we saw during the mid-2000s is we basically had 20% of borrowers that had a credit score of 760 plus. Then we had some regulatory changes, and we saw that go from 20% to 50% to 60%, up to 70%. And where we are now, or really since the pandemic, is the buyers that have been active in the market, 60 to 70% have really excellent credit scores. And I think to me, this is one of the things that gives me the most peace about the market, is how strong some of those key fundamentals are. Now with that, I would like to reintroduce Tim Sullivan. As many of you know, Tim is our Chief Advisory Officer here at Zonda, running our entire custom market study business. Among other things, Tim and his team work on lot and product segmentation, mixed use studies, and metro district analysis across the country. Tim has over 30 years of experience, travels almost every week, and is a lifelong learner. Beyond that, I wanted to highlight Tim's role in coaching the team. Just between the two of us, we do a collective 200 presentations a year. And with that volume, you've got to imagine things go wrong. And they do. We have had janky laptops, lights go out during presentations, clickers stop working, fire alarms, medical emergencies, hecklers, that's a fun one, and so much more. Tim has a history in improv, and he's had to teach us how to just roll with the punches and move on. So Tim, thanks for your leadership, and I'm passing to you.
Ali, it is my pleasure. And what was it, Darwin, that said it's not the strongest that survives, but the most adaptable. So let's embrace that. We've got a couple things that I want to go over with you before you go. First of all, as you were going through the shifts worth watching and talked about savings and debt and the fact that our mortgage situations and student loans, not so bad, auto loans and maybe credit card debt, not so good, you used a term, data sin. Share with the audience what a data sin is.
A data sin. So I use that in reference to the credit card debt that shows it's way higher than anything we have on record. And you will find people in particular on YouTube or Twitter that will take that data set and love that it's doom and gloom news. And they'll show it as, wow, this is horrible. But it's a data sin because it's not actually how you should be interpreting the data, at least in my opinion.
That. Now, Michael has a really interesting question, and I'm going to bring you back to the student loan numbers. And Michael put out, he said, basically, aren't the student loan numbers that we're tracking only for the federal student loans? And this doesn't include the student loans that would be really classified under private lenders. Can you give us some on that?
Yeah, so when we look at the student loans, I know at least I don't know how the private exactly worked during the pandemic, so I don't want to give a full answer on that. But I would say many of the student loans are going to be public, and they're going to have gone through the forbearance and coming back due. Some people will go into the private market and refinance to get a better rate, but still, sometimes people will do that because they have a high balance. So I wouldn't discount the impact of the student loan changes.
Fair enough. And Michael, we'll keep an eye on that because I think it's an important comparison. He also had mentioned something along the lines of, how people are looking at the 3% and 4% mortgage rate world. Will we ever get back there, or psychologically, do we need to adapt to the world that probably a 5 handle or a 6 handle is the future? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, when you look back, when we were looking at those interest rates over history, we had not had interest rates that low. So I think it's unlikely that we get back there, but we just don't know if there's the only way you get back there is to have something catastrophic happen. So I think in a way, we don't even want to hope to get back there. What we want to hope for is at least that current mortgage rates are a more narrow spread between what people have and what's available to at least help some people be willing to sell their home.
Well said. And it's that good news can be bad news can be good news. So we're going to keep monitoring that. Last thing is this, Ellie. I'm so with you on the October numbers will show that there was an inflection point. And in conversations with a couple of the builders that were working deep into the land bank side of the world or new development, they've reflected that too. What I'd be really interested in is, because you meet with boards and because you have offline conversations with builders, give us just some additional color on, because I'm going to show some numbers in a minute about the way they're looking at land purchases and the way they're looking at next year. Pretty positive, but give us just a colorful piece or two for what you're hearing behind closed doors.
I think probably the biggest thing that stands out to me in the conversations is many people still talk about, the systemic undersupply, want to backfill the land. Like you said, you'll cover that. I think the biggest concern that I'm hearing is we keep talking about affordability and how do we get prices under control, but land prices have not come down. And depending on the market, land's 20 to 50% of the home price. And there's just a question of like, okay, so we are trying to backfill land, but how are we going to solve for affordability when one of our key inputs is still so expensive? So I think that's probably the biggest question mark to figure out.
And Ali, that is the perfect segue into basically a word cloud that we want to share with you. And in the commentary that Ali was just addressing, these are what the home builders are sharing with us on the world of home building right now. And you see the first setup here, up and down, choppy, and then affordability. Ali just mentioned that point too, a cautious element. Then also urgency. There's no urgency, and there's a roller coaster ride. And perhaps the thing that is the single most important was what Ali ended with, was the concept of scarce land, but expensive and challenging cost environment. And it is not easy. I mean, I've been in this industry for many, many decades, and home building has never been an easy industry. It's very complex, a lot of moving parts, but it's never been more difficult. And I'm going to talk about a couple of reasons why, but of course, cost is one of the first. Now, the way we would quantify the way builders or qualify the way builders are thinking about land is still pretty enthusiastic, because it's hard to find. But because it's hard to find, it's expensive. And in looking at these numbers, how are you thinking about your land strategy? Look at full steam ahead. It's down a little bit from the August numbers of this year, but it's still 43% are saying full steam ahead, and 53% are saying we're cautious, but we're moving forward. And then ultimately, what do you see with land prices? Look, land prices are generally moving higher. No surprise here, because it is the law of supply and demand here. Now, as you know, we track the lot supply index, which is effectively looking at the pipeline of lots against starts in a market. And notice on the national level, it's kind of flattened out. And overall, we look at the market relatively undersupplied, but we've also broken it out. I mean, if you look at the top segment here, these are the markets that, we feel are appropriately supplied, at least right now. And you can see how the index has changed year over year. That's what's in the parentheses. And Austin and San Antonio, Denver, Boise, Phoenix, all of those markets were fast moving in 2020 to 2022. And they're leveling out. Slightly undersupplied still, Salt Lake and Dallas, and then you can see the significantly undersupplied markets. But notice almost every market has had an increase in the index value, except, of course, Los Angeles. And if you've done any development in Southern California or Los Angeles specifically, talk about restricted land supply, that is the baby for it. Now, in tracking lots, we're tracking the situation the lots are in. What status are they? Is there road work, excavation, equipment on site? But Ali, as we look at these quarterly, one of the things that I've noticed is just how we've really started to ease off, because for a number of quarters, you can see from 2020 to 2022, we were moving pretty well with bringing new lots to the market. And as I mentioned, the important thing to look at is the status of these lots. And if you see the little golden square or the golden pie shape right there, only 5% are in that element where they're basically ready to go. That's the streets in, ready to go. And in fact, let me show you a little bit more from there. This gives you a sense market by market. Now, these numbers are imperfect. There's always a little bit of a lag, but you're going to hear this theme from me more than once today. It's not just looking at a pipeline, it's understanding what's really moving forward. By the way, hint, 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 foreshadow. I'm going to mention that in the build to rent side of the world, but also this is one of the red flags that we would throw up if we saw the numbers on the right-hand side exploding. They're not exploding. The street's in, the product that's ready to go. It's just not moving as fast as it could. Part of this is municipality driven. I'll show you that in a second. But part of it also is just, the time it takes to develop and bring product to the market. And that's the point we always leave. It's not all the lots will enter the market at the same time. Now, give you two quick perspectives on some of the markets and how they've moved. The first thing I'm showing you here is the top markets. These are housing starts, and this is a year-over-year comparison. So look at some of the markets that are up and some of the markets that are down. For instance, three of the markets that are down were three of the fastest moving markets in 2020 to 2022, and that's Phoenix and Austin, and of course, Denver. Now they're pulling back a little bit. Part of it is affordability driven. Part of it is builders realizing, hey, we've got to rethink what we're bringing to market because, as you heard Ali talking about, nothing's getting cheaper. So how do we spin on that? But look, year over year, can see where some of the changes have been. Dallas had a pretty significant shift, but let's look at it a different way. Let's look at it from the standpoint of quarter over quarter. And notice, for instance, with Dallas has actually pulled back in this last quarter. So while you look at it from an annual basis, the market was expanding. Right now, in more real time, you see these markets pulling back. And Vegas is in there with a little bit of a contraction, Phoenix with contraction, which is consistent with their year-over-year numbers. Now, I had mentioned, there are factors that are always in our way in the world of home building. And for, I guess it's been almost 5 years now, we've been tracking very closely these four factors: government services, labor, supply, and land. But the key thing, and I asked this question in panels and during our events, if you could wave a magic wand, builder one or builder two, what would you change? And almost always it goes to the municipality and the difficulty of getting things approved. And the right-hand side of this graphic, you can see these are actual quotes from our building clients that are saying, basically municipalities are taking too much time. And that also goes back to the lot information I was sharing with you, that the slow play of getting things approved and then developed really holds us back. Okay, time to talk about the big A, affordability. And I don't think anything will be too surprising, but there's some things moving around here. Now, notice that every month we ask these questions: what's your biggest worry? Notice that land prices are fifth now, where, pretty much through summer and into early fall, land was usually the first or second element mentioned. Right now, if you read left to right, consumer confidence, affordability, general economic uncertainty, I'd put those three together as affordability. But let's dive a little deeper into that. Let's look at some of the markets and how they've changed. And I'm going to give you a toggle here. First, we'll look at price, and then I'll give you a different perspective. Now, this gives you 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, various markets where these are the highest priced non-coastal markets. And I'm sure you've heard before, Denver and many of the markets in Colorado have conventionally been the highest priced non-coastal markets. But let's see how that shifted just recently. Look at Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins, and Greeley, top four. Now, again, these are prices that are non-coastal markets. But let's look at it a little different way. Not just the front range, but let's consider the non-coastal markets, and let's shift that to a price to income ratio and use Riverside, San Bernardino as an example. Back in 1980, that ratio of home price to income ratio was a little under 5. Still probably lower than we'd like to see it, probably in the 3 to 4 range back then. That would be acceptable. And then look to the right, you can see how many of these markets have changed. How about now? Well, with Boulder, 8.4. With Vegas, 6.6, Reno, 6.9. Reno and Vegas, they have been influenced heavily by California buyers. But Boulder and Fort Collins, very, very strong tech markets. And Eugene, that has a whole bunch of influences, not the least of which are baby chasers and retirement market. So let's think about this now. With builders and the challenges that they have, one of the questions is, did you increase prices this last month? And guys, if you've been following this, you know that over the last number of months, it's slowed a little bit. Certainly 2020 to 2022, we were seeing pretty significant price increases. Right now, There's 71% of builders are saying, nope, we are not changing. And even 13% say they lowered the base price. Now, keep that 13% in mind. I want you to keep that in mind because I'm going to look at this and go behind the curtain. Importantly, for many of the builders, QMI, quick move-ins, have been their pivot points because if they've got a home that's built or just about ready to go, it's easier for them to adjust pricing or to have giveaways. They've got sunk costs, they've got the interest rate clock ticking, and it's basically a gross profit margin play. So look at this market by market, Jacksonville, Orlando, Dallas, Austin. You can see that most of the markets here had projects that had QMI, which has been good news for the market. Now, in working with consumers, what has been the most effective way to get them to respond? Now, look at mortgage rate buy downs, funds towards closing costs, and flex dollars. Now, as we look at that and think about the market, these are the levers that are being pulled. But as we get through the QMI element, we've got a new cost structure. And I think builders are faced with probably a more challenging marketplace in which to play. Then in asking, when you are offering mortgage rate buy downs, look at the sweet spot. It's really kind of that mid 5 to mid 6. That's where the builders are targeting. And remember what Ali showed with the expectations of where 30-year fixed interest rates would be next year at the end of the year. And most of the estimates are in the very high 5s to mid to high 6s. Now, that's kind of an important comparison because that's where the builders have been trying to get current interest rates down. And when you're looking at actual dollar amounts, what the heck's going on here? Because when you think about a market like Tulsa, where you can find a beautiful home for $350,000, giving away $10,000, $15,000 towards closing costs can be meaningful. Now, if you're in Irvine with a $1.5 million home, it's a little bit different. So we acknowledge this because we wanted to get the actual numbers, but when it really comes down to the dollar amounts, it's so different market by market. Now, it's not just the world of new homes that are starting to experience this incentive element price play. It's happening on the resale side. And what you see on the left-hand side is a Redfin graphic that shows almost 7% of listings had prices that were reduced in October of 2023. But also notice the right-hand side of this graphic. Notice November and December. And Ali, I think this is something that you brought up with seasonality plus, because seasonality exists pretty much in every market. When it comes around Thanksgiving and Christmas, people are pulling back from buying, and either they say, we'll just wait until next year, or they have to be incented to move because they're distracted because of everything else that's going on. And then when you look at that shift over time, again, by the way, guys, I want to make sure you know this is 2020, 21, 22, and 23. You can see the left-hand side of the graphic. But now it's the percent of the pending sales that are under contract within 2 weeks. And notice that this also shows in all those years that seasonality I was mentioning. And now we're seeing that we are just having a little slower market for people to go into contract. So the resale side is feeling it. Now, with those increased prices, we've had another pivot point, and that is rent versus own. And if you go back, the last 10 years from 2020 back to 2010, it was generally cheaper to buy than to rent. We had interest rates at 2 and 3%, no duh. But now with higher interest rates, you certainly see that it's cheaper to rent now. And that's an important factor for us because we're tracking that build to rent space, and the build to rent space is feeling the same type of influence because of affordability factors. And when you look at all these markets, these are the markets where it's more expensive, where homeownership is more expensive than renting. And keep in mind that when we look at this, we're looking at rents for single family homes, but it would go very similarly for the apartment side. And here's a brief take on our rental housing outlook, and you can find this data in there. But note, on the build to rent side, and keep in mind, build to rent, as a reminder, it includes the horizontal apartments, the cottage style. It includes townhomes and small homes, and then single family detached. But look at the shift in the type of product that we're seeing. We're seeing more density, and it shouldn't be a surprise because it's a response to affordability. And one of the last factors I want to share with you before we do our wrap up is that when you look at the markets where there's build to rent in the pipeline, you look at Phoenix and Dallas and Atlanta and say, wow, there's a lot of stuff planned. The key thing, particularly right now, is that those planned units are probably not financed, or they're on hold with a capital partner saying, we're committed to this deal, but we're going to wait a few months to see how the market plays out. So the important thing to differentiate here is that it shouldn't be a surprise where the hotbeds are of rental, but the true amount that comes to the market, we're going to track that, because I think certainly over the next year, with interest rates the way they are and the capital markets tied down a little bit, we won't see all this product come to market. In fact, I don't think we'll see the majority of it come to market, at least in the next couple of years. All right, let's go to a couple of factors for our final thoughts. Number one, we always want to share good news, and this one impacts us directly. And the concept here is that ADUs can have a factor that they can be brought in as income when people are qualifying for a mortgage. I love that concept, and California is kind of leading the way. This is one of the few good things that California has done, is bringing the ADUs in, and now with FHA allowing that extra income to serve, a little bit easier to qualify. You know that I love the human interest stories. This gentleman was walking 4 hours round trip to work every day, works 7 days a week, and had a good Samaritan, somebody he knows and loves well, buy him a car. Simple little stuff, but it gives me faith in humanity. And speaking of faith in humanity, there are often concerns that the younger generation isn't going to step up and do what they have to do to make this world a better place. Well, this 14-year-old boy, his name is Heman Bekele. This young man was named America's top young scientist. He created a bar of soap that helps treat skin cancer. And this is a 14-year-old saying, I've always been interested in biology and technology. And that is an amazing thing for a young kid. Now, a couple of other things. Allie mentioned that she and I both travel a lot, but we don't quite travel like this gentleman does. Frank Rubio, who is an NSA astronaut, was kind of stuck in space for a year. He was supposed to come back after a number of months, so they think about a 6-month time frame. But the area that he was in had a punctured exterior, and because of that, he had to stay in space a little over a year. That is, that's a road warrior, no doubt about it. And coming from the area of really wonderful human beings, this is Charles Feeney, who you probably have come across and didn't know it. He's the guy that created most of the duty-free shops in the airports. And he made about $8 billion and made a commitment to giving it all away before he died. And he did. He passed away just a month or two ago and gave away $8 billion. And talk about people that are committed. A couple that was married for 69 years. They spent their last moments together. I mention this only because if you've got somebody that you love, that you've lost, you know how important it is where you're together at the end. Now, Allie, I'm going to bring you back in because just before I mentioned Mr. Shea, I've got a question for you. But I wanted to acknowledge the Shea family and also the Shea Communities Development Company. They lost one of their leaders and family members, Peter Shea, who passed away at 88. I had the opportunity to meet Peter many, many years ago, and I wanted to send love and respect and condolences to the family. He was a remarkable human being, and if you get a chance to work with the Shea Company in any way, shape, or form, whether it's commercial or housing, if you get a chance to meet Bert Silva, any of the people that work at Shea, they're a spectacularly family-oriented place. And we send our condolences to the Shays, and Peter Shea and his brothers, his cousins, his uncles, his aunts. They were just are an amazing family. So Allie, come on back before we go, because I think you've got something to add related to student loans. Come on back.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And this is why I love working with Zonda. We got asked a question that I didn't know the exact stats for. We have a PhD on staff. His name's John Mazzaros. John's listening in. John did the research and we have an answer. So the question was about the federally backed versus the private student loans. And what John was able to find was that 93% of student loans are federally financed. And then it's a little bit dated, but still available. We also know that the Department of Education owns 90% of outstanding loans. So I think that's probably why I hadn't come across private versus the federally financed, just because the federally financed makes up such a massive share of overall student loans.
Holly, as always, thank you. And thank you for the great research, the ongoing so what's and what ifs. And John, thank you for that quick turn. And everybody, we appreciate you being here. This is the last one of our get-togethers for the year. We will send out an announcement for our next plan in January. But we appreciate all of your questions, your ideas, and thank you for working with us. We appreciate it. Take care, everybody, and have a great holiday season. Bye-bye.